November 10th, 1924, 11:30 in the morning. A flower shop at 738 North State Street, Chicago, directly across from the stone face of Holy Name Cathedral. In the back room, surrounded by the sweet rot of cut stems, a compact 32-year-old man is clipping chrysanthemums for the biggest funeral the city has ever staged. His name is Dean O'Banion, and he is two men at once. He is the co-owner of Schofield's Flowers, the shop that handles every wedding and funeral in gangland, a craftsman genuinely gifted with arrangements, a devout Catholic who serves at the cathedral across the street, where he was once an altar boy. And he is the boss of the North Side, the Irish gang lord whose beer empire earns him, by the estimates of the day, $1 million a year, whose crews hijack, bootleg, and kill, and who has spent the past 6 months laughing publicly at the most dangerous men in America. 3 men enter the shop. O'Banion comes out from the back, shears still in one hand, and says the last words anyone will ever hear from him. "Hello, boys. You from Mike Merlo's?" He extends his hand. The tall man in the middle takes it and does not let go. The 2 men flanking him step forward and fire 6 bullets into O'Banion at handshake distance, 2 in the chest, 2 in the face, 2 in the throat, and the florist of the North Side dies among his own chrysanthemums. In the shadow of his own church, the killers walk out. No one is ever convicted. The police captain on the case notices the one detail that matters and says it plainly. O'Banion never shook hands with strangers. He kept his hands free by his guns for strangers. He shook this man's hand. He knew them. And with that handshake, Chicago's 5-year war begins, a war that will consume every man who ordered it, every man who fought it, and end on a garage floor on Valentine's Day. 66 years later, the Coen brothers made a film about an Irish boss who runs his city, the Italian rival who demands a chiseler's head, and the war that follows when the Irishman says no. They called the boss Leo O'Bannon. The homage is not subtle, and it is not decoration. Miller's Crossing, 1990, with Albert Finney's Leo mowing down assassins to Danny Boy and Gabriel Byrne's Tom Reagan navigating between the layers, is fiction built from Dashiell Hammett's novels The Glass Key and Red Harvest, books about corrupt machines and rival factions in cities where the underworld and City Hall share an office. And Hammett built those books from life, from his own years as a Pinkerton detective in the poisoned company town of Butte, Montana, the city he barely renamed Poisonville. The whole lineage, film to novel to street, points back at one documented place in time, the American Prohibition city, where an Irish boss and an Italian boss really did divide a metropolis, really did own its politicians, and really did go to war over money, respect, and a double cross. The purest case on record is Chicago, and the man the movie's Leo is named for. So this is the real story behind Miller's Crossing. The piece that carved up a city, the $500,000 chisel, the handshake in the flower shop, and the war whose ending was so much colder than anything the Coens dared film. And hold this difference the whole way, because it is the episode's spine. In the movie, Leo survives the war, wins, and keeps his city. Watch what the record does with every single man who held Leo's position in the real one. Start with the peace, because the war only makes sense against it. When Prohibition arrived in 1920, the man who understood it first was Johnny Torrio, the quiet, business-minded boss of the South Side. A man who hated gunfire the way an accountant hates fire in the ledger room. Torrio's insight was the film's insight. Beer was not a racket. It was a utility, and utilities require order. So he organized the city's gangs into a cartel. Territories drawn, prices fixed, disputes arbitrated, everyone rich, and the arrangement rested on the 2 pillars every layer cake of that era rested on. The first was politics. Chicago under Mayor Big Bill Thompson was a wide-open town, the machine and the underworld feeding each other votes, cash, and protection. Police captains on payrolls, aldermen at gangster funerals, The exact world the film sketches when the mayor and the police chief sit in Leo's office, waiting to be told what to think. The second pillar was personality, and it had a name. Mike Merlo, president of the Unione Siciliana, the Sicilian community's great fraternal society, a genuinely diplomatic man who believed the business ran best in peace, and whose word alone restrained the city's most trigger-eager faction, the Genna brothers, 6 Sicilian siblings running industrial-scale alcohol, cooking out of Little Italy. Under Torrio's map and Merlo's diplomacy, the arrangement held for years. The North Side, with its breweries and its better beer, belonged to O'Banion. And O'Banion, charming, generous, altar-serving, hair-trigger O'Banion, was the arrangement's one ungovernable piece, a man who hijacked allies' trucks for sport and answered every complaint with a grin. The Gennas begged for permission to kill him. Torrio said no, because Merlo would never sanction it. Remember the chain of that sentence. The Irishman lived because one old Sicilian preferred peace. And give O'Banion the full portrait his strangeness deserves, because no screenwriter would dare invent him. Born downstate in 1892 and raised in the North Side's Irish slum of Kilgubbin, called Little Hell, he came up as a choir boy who sang at Holy Name and a slugger for the circulation wars of the Chicago newspapers, cracking heads to control newsstands, an apprenticeship half the era's gangsters shared. A childhood streetcar accident left him with a shortened leg and a permanent limp, and by the accounts of everyone who knew him, a compensating charm that could light a room and a temper with no visible fuse at all. He carried 3 guns in tailored pockets, tipped like a prince, gave rivals' funerals their most beautiful arrangements with his own hands, and was, in the same body, a killer whom police connected to a long ledger of dead men, though he was never once convicted of any of it. The flower shop was not a front in the ordinary sense. It was the truest thing about him, the one room where both of his lives were welcome. Chicago has produced stranger men, but never one who arranged the lilies for the funerals he caused. Then came the chisel, and it deserves the full breakdown, because it is the most famous double cross of the Prohibition era, and the seed of everything. Step 1, the setup. In the spring of 1924, O'Banion let it be known he was tired, frightened of the Gennas, ready to retire from beer. He offered to sell Torrio his stake in their shared crown jewel, the Sieben Brewery at 1466 North Larrabee Street, for $500,000 cash. Step 2, the secret. O'Banion's police sources had told him what Torrio did not know, that the brewery was scheduled to be raided and padlocked by the authorities on May 19th. Step 3, the spring. The sale closed. On the night of the 19th, both men attended the final shipment. The raid came down exactly on schedule, and everyone present was arrested for O'Banion, a first offense, a fine, nothing. For Torrio, with a prior record, the arrest meant certain jail time, plus the loss of the brewery, plus the loss of $500,000, which O'Banion asked politely and then impolitely, declined to return. Step 4, the laugh. O'Banion did not deny the chisel. He celebrated it, and the words reported in every account since, his crack about what the Sicilians could go do with themselves, traveled to every ear in Little Italy within days. And step 5, the arithmetic. Torrio, the man of peace, now stood humiliated, indicted, and robbed, with the Gennas demanding the answer they had always demanded. The record shows he gave it. Permission. All that stood between O'Banion and the consequence was old Mike Merlo's disapproval. On November 8th, 1924, Mike Merlo died of cancer. The peace of Chicago died in that hospital bed with him. 2 days later, 3 men came to the flower shop to order arrangements for Merlo's funeral, and you already know what they ordered instead. The city gave O'Banion a send-off nearly the equal of Merlo's own. A bronze casket, mountains of flowers from the same shop where he bled, tens of thousands in the streets, gangsters and aldermen shoulder to shoulder. Chicago buried the florist like a statesman, then reached for its guns. Because the North Side did not scatter, it avenged. and the war's chain of custody is the most operatic sequence in American crime. O'Banion's heirs were Jaime Weiss, dark, brilliant, and by every account genuinely deranged with grief for his friend, and the polish of Vincent Drucci and the swagger of George Bugs Moran behind him. Their answer came on January 24th, 1925. Johnny Torrio, returning from shopping with his wife, was ambushed outside his own apartment, shot to pieces at the curb, and survived only because, by the accounts of the scene, the finishing gun failed at his skull. The great peacemaker of Chicago crime, recovered in a hospital ringed with bodyguards, served his brewery sentence, and then did the most intelligent thing any man in this entire episode ever did. He quit. Torrio handed the whole South Side machine to his young lieutenant, a 26-year-old named Al Capone, and left the country. Sit with that irony. The double cross aimed at Torrio created Capone. O'Banion's chisel, meant to humiliate one Italian boss, promoted the century's most famous one. The war now belonged to Weiss and Capone, and it escalated past anything the movie stages. On September 20th, 1926, Weiss led a motorcade of cars past the Hawthorne Hotel in Cicero, Capone's own fortress, and poured roughly 1,000 rounds of machine gun and shotgun fire into the building in broad daylight. A military raid in an American suburb, which Capone survived flat on a restaurant floor, afterward quietly paying the medical bills of a bystander wounded in the storm. 3 weeks later, the answer came, and its staging belongs in Scripture. On October 11th, 1926, gunmen who had rented a room overlooking State Street opened up with a machine gun as Jaime Weiss crossed toward his headquarters, the flower shop itself, killing him at 28 on the pavement beside Holy Name Cathedral, the same stones that had shadowed O'Banion's murder, and the cathedral's cornerstone carried the bullet scars for years. The war was now consuming its bosses in order. Drucci, next in line, never even got a gangland death, shot dead by a police officer in the back of a squad car during an election sweep in April 1927. The only boss in this story killed by the law, which left Bugs Moran and left Capone with a problem he decided to solve all at once. The solution came on February 14th, 1929, at a red brick garage at 2122 North Clark Street, and it is the most famous mass killing in American history. 7 men of the Moran organization, waiting that morning for a whiskey shipment, looked up to see what appeared to be a police raid. 2 uniformed officers and plainclothesmen, and did what professionals do in a routine pinch. They lined up against the wall, unresisting. The uniforms were costumes. The machine guns emptied into their backs, and the only man still technically alive when the real police arrived, Frank Gusenberg, with more than a dozen bullets in him, answered the oldest question in Chicago with the code, "He died inside. Nobody shot me." Moran himself had approached the garage minutes late, seen what he took for a police car, and walked away, saved by the very raid theater designed to relax his men. And from safety he gave reporters the epitaph of the whole war in 5 reported words. "Only Capone kills like that. The Valentine's Day Massacre won the war and destroyed the winner." The photographs of the garage wall revolted the entire country, made Capone the face of everything Prohibition had curdled into, and turned the full machinery of the federal government toward him, the machinery that, as we told in our Capone episode, finally took him not for the wall but for his taxes, 11 years. In October 1931, the city war ended because Washington confiscated it, and the machine politics behind it all, the film's true subject, ran exactly as the Coens drew it, only louder. Big Bill Thompson returned to the mayor's office in 1927 on a campaign that gangland money openly favored, and the primary elections of April 1928 turned so violent, with the homes of politicians bombed across the city, that history remembers the season as the Pineapple Primary, pineapple being the street's word for a hand grenade. Ballots, bombs, and beer were one economy. When the film puts the mayor and the chief in Leo's waiting room, it is not satire. It is a documentary drawing with the serial numbers filed off. The layer above the layer cake in the real Chicago, as in the movie, was elected. One more layer belongs to Hammett and the Coens, the Kraft layer, because the lineage is documented and it explains the film's uncanny authority. Hammett worked Butte as a Pinkerton operative in the era of Montana's labor wars, a company town so owned, bought, and poisoned that he fictionalized it as Poisonville with barely a coat of paint, and he carried out of that work, by his own later telling, a permanent understanding that American corruption was not an infection in the system, but a load-bearing wall of it. Red Harvest turned that understanding into a nameless operative, setting a corrupt city's factions against each other until the town burns clean. The Glass Key turned it into a fixer, navigating between his boss, a political machine, and a murder. The Coens took both books, folded them together, and shot the result with the fedoras and Tommy guns of the beer war era, Finney's Leo carrying O'Banion's name, Polito's Caspar delivering the film's opening sermon about ethics in a business with none, a speech every real boss in this episode would have nodded along to while planning the speaker's funeral. Critics in 1990 found the film cold. The record suggests the opposite. It is the rare gangster film honest enough to admit that in this world, the talk of friendship, character, and ethics is the murder weapon's polish. Now the ledger of endings, and the 1957 symmetry that closes it like a novel. O'Banion, dead at 32 among his flowers. Weiss, dead at 28 beside the cathedral. Drucci, dead in a police car. The Genus, shattered and scattered by the war's first year. 3 brothers dead in months. Frankie Yale, the handshake man of the flower shop, machine-gunned in Brooklyn in 1928 in a car Capone's money had reportedly filled with his killers. Scalise and Anselmi, the 2 shooters flanking that handshake, beaten and shot to death in 1929 by the enduring accounts at a banquet hosted by Capone himself, who had come to doubt them. Capone, imprisoned, syphilitic, dead at 48 in 1947, his mind gone years before his body. And then the 2 survivors, whose deaths arrived in the same year like a matched set. Bugs Moran, the last North Side boss, declined into small robberies and died broke in Leavenworth Federal Prison in February 1957. Johnny Torrio, the man who built the piece, walked away in 1925 and lived 3 more decades untouched, dying of a heart attack in April 1957 at 75. In a Brooklyn barber's chair. The only man who won the Chicago Beer War was the man who quit it. Every other chair at the table went to the state, the disease, or the gun. So weigh the film against the record one last time. Miller's Crossing is a movie about whether loyalty can survive inside a world built entirely on angles, and it loves its characters enough to let its Leo win. Gray and standing, his city kept. The record extends no such affection. The real Leo died mid-handshake, trusting the wrong Italians over funeral flowers. His avenger died beside the church they both prayed in. The rival he chiseled quit and outlived them all, and the war's final trophy was a garage wall that disgusted a nation into ending the whole era. Hammett, who had seen Poisonville with his own Pinkerton eyes, understood what the Coens' beautiful film finally bows to. In the city where the mob and the machine share an office, there is no crossing where you get to keep both your ethics and your life. The real Chicago offered every man in this story that same choice, and the record shows exactly one man choosing correctly. He chose the barber's chair 30 years later over the flower shop floor. In this world, that is what winning looks like. If this story hit you, subscribe. Every week we dig into the true stories the movies only began to tell, and the truth is always heavier than the script. Drop a comment. Which story should we investigate next?